Cinderella. This is from my book house, Through the Gate. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest, vainest, most selfish woman that was ever seen. She had 2 daughters who were exactly like her in all things. The gentleman had also a daughter, but she was a young girl of the rarest sweetness and goodness. The mother could not bear the goodness of this young girl because it made the pride and ill temper of her own daughters appear all the more ugly. So she gave her the hardest work in the house to do in order that none of their visitors might notice her. She had to scour the dishes, scrub the floors, and clean the whole house from top to bottom. She had to sleep in the attic upon a wretched bed of straw, while her sisters lay in fine rooms on the very softest beds. When the girl bore all this patiently, nor would she make her father unhappy by complaining to him of her lot. When she had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner and sit down among the cinders. Hence, though her name was Ella, she was called by her sisters Cinderella. Cinderella had only the poorest rags for clothes, but the sweetness and goodness that shone in her face made her 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, however richly they might be dressed. It once happened that the king's son gave a very grand ball to which all the great people of the kingdom were invited. Our young misses were highly delighted to receive an invitation. At once they began to busy themselves in choosing the gowns and the petticoats, the headdresses which they would wear. Poor little Cinderella was not invited. Yet as she worked to get her sisters ready to go, they talked the whole day long of nothing but what they would do at the ball. "For my part," said the elder, "I shall wear my blue velvet suit with French trimmings." "And I," said the younger, "shall wear my old skirt, but then to make up for that, I shall put on my gold-flowered mantle and my splendid diamond stomacher." At last the happy day came. Though Cinderella was sad to think she must stay at home, she offered very sweetly to dress her sisters' hair, and even as she worked, they said unkind things to her. "Cinderella, don't you wish you could go to the ball? How people would laugh to see a Cinder girl at a ball." Cinderella made no answer. She went on arranging their hair. So at last she had them looking as well as 2 young misses could, whose faces expressed nothing but pride and ill temper. They paraded up and down before the long mirrors in their rooms, and then they got into the family coach and drove away to court. Cinderella looked after them until they were far out of sight, and then she crept into her corner by the chimney and fell softly a-crying. But Cinderella, like all good girls, was watched over by a fairy godmother, and as she sat there in tears, her good fairy appeared before her. "My dear, dear child," said the queer little old lady, "why are you crying?" "Oh, I wish I could—" Cinderella could not finish for sobbing. "You wish," said the fairy, "that you could go to the ball. Is not that so?" Oh, yes," answered Cinderella, sighing. "Well," said the fairy, "be but a good girl, and I will see that you go." Then she commanded the dear child to run into the garden and bring her a pumpkin. Cinderella went obediently and gathered the finest she could find, though she hadn't the smallest idea how a pumpkin would help her get to the ball. Her fairy godmother scooped out all the inside, leaving nothing but the rind, and then she struck it with her wand, and behold, the pumpkin became a splendid gilded coach. Next, the fairy godmother went to look in the mouse traps, where she found 6 mice. Then she ordered Cinderella to lift the door of each trap, and as the mouse ran out, she would give it a tap with her wand. At once the mouse was changed into a horse, till before them stood 6 fine horses of a beautiful mouse-colored gray. Then she had Cinderella bring her the rat trap. In that was a very large rat with splendid whiskers, and she turned him into a coachman. Last of all, she said, "Go into the garden, Cinderella, and bring me the 6 lizards you'll find behind the watering pot." No sooner had Cinderella done as she was commanded than the lizards became 6 footmen in gold-embroidered coats. They skipped up at once behind the coach and sat there as grandly as though they had done nothing all their lives but serve in such a position. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Now you see a carriage fit to take you to the ball." "Oh, yes, thank you," cried Cinderella. and the godmother touched her with the wand, and at that same moment her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all decked with jewels. Then the fairy gave her a pair of the prettiest glass slippers in the world, and said, as she stepped joyously into the carriage, "This one command only you must obey. Do not on any account stay at the ball after midnight. If you do, your coach will become a pumpkin again, your horses mice, your coachman a rat, your footmen lizards, and your clothes the same rags you wore before." Cinderella promised to obey, and then she drove away. The king's son, being told that a great princess whom nobody knew was to come to the ball, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted from the coach, and led her into the hall where the company was gathered. At once, when she appeared, there fell all over a deep silence. Everyone left off dancing, and the violins ceased to play. On all sides, ladies and gentlemen whispered, "How beautiful she is!" The king's son conducted her to a seat of honor, and afterwards led her out to dance. She danced so gracefully that all admired her. She was kind and courteous, too, even to her ill-tempered stepsisters, who did not for a moment recognize in this lovely princess their little Cinder girl. At last, a splendid feast was served, but in the midst of it all, Cinderella heard the clock strike 12:15. She rose and said farewell, and then she hastened away. When she got back home, she found her godmother waiting. Gratefully, she thanked the little old lady for what she had done. But as she was telling her all that had happened, the two sisters knocked at the door. The fairy changed Cinderella's brocaded gown to rags again and disappeared in a twinkling. In her poor old clothes, Cinderella opened the door. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would have seen the finest, most beautiful princess that ever your eyes looked on. She was very kind to us, too, and showed us much attention, but a little cinder girl like you could never dream of such beauty." Cinderella asked if they knew the name of the princess. "No," the stepsisters answered, "no one knows her name, but the king's son would give all the world to know." The next night the prince asked everyone again to a ball that he might once more see the beautiful princess. Cinderella's two sisters went, and when they were gone and the house was still, her godmother came as before and made Cinderella ready. The dress she wore on the second night was even more lovely than the one she had at first. The king's son welcomed her with beaming eyes and was always by her side. They danced with the same grace and beauty to the lovely music, and then they feasted as before. But when the clock struck 11:45, Cinderella remembered her godmother's words and went obediently home. The third night, the king's son gave another ball. Once again the two sisters went, and after them Cinderella. Not a thing was less fine and splendid than on the 2 nights preceding. Indeed, the music was so beautiful, the room was so bright, and everything was so full of joy that Cinderella never once thought how time was flying. Suddenly, the clock of the palace began to strike. 1, 2, 3, 4. When she heard, Cinderella fled. Nimbly as a deer she ran. 5, 6, 7, 8. She was on the broad steps outside the palace. 9, 10. One little glass slipper fell from her foot, but she dared not stop to pick it up. 11, 12. Her clothes all turned to rags, her coach disappeared, mice, lizards, and rats scampered off in the darkness, and as fast as she could, Cinderella ran home. All she had left of her finery was one little glass slipper, the mate to the one she had lost. In great dismay, the prince ran out from the palace after her. Not a sign of her was anywhere to be seen. The guards at the gate said no splendid princess had passed them. They had seen nobody but a poorly dressed country girl who ran as if for her life. The prince was very sorrowful, and he had a search made everywhere. But all he could find of the beautiful princess was the one little glass slipper she had dropped. For days and days he searched. Then at last he had his servitors march up and down through the length and the breadth of the kingdom, giving notice with sound of trumpet that every lady in the land should try on the little glass slipper. So small it was, he knew that none but the rightful princess could wear it. Hence he gave orders that whoever could get her foot into it should straightway become his bride. They began by trying the slipper on the princesses, then on the duchesses, then on the other ladies of the court. Not one of them did it fit. At last it was brought to Cinderella's two proud sisters, who each did all they could to squeeze in her foot. They pinched up their heels and drew in their toes, but in vain. Cinderella, meantime, stood by and watched what was going on. She knew her slipper, and when her sisters had failed, she said to them modestly, "Let me see if it will not fit me." The sisters burst out laughing. "Could a Cinder girl wear such a slipper?" they cried. But the messenger who was sent out on the search, finding Cinderella very beautiful, said it was but fair that she should try it. So Cinderella sat down, and the gentleman put the slipper on her foot. Behold, it went on easily and fitted her like wax. The two sisters were dumb with amazement, but their amazement was greater still when Cinderella pulled out of the pocket the mate to that beautiful slipper. Thereupon in came her good fairy, who touched the girl's clothes with her wand, and lo, they became more magnificent than any she had worn before. And now her two sisters found her to be that beautiful lady who had been so kind to them at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all their ill treatment of her. Cinderella lifted them up, kissed them, and said she forgave them with all of her heart. She was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever. A few days later, he led her as his bride to live with him at the palace. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her two sisters a home at court. Henceforth, they were kinder women. And that was Cinderella, the story before Disney. So this was in 1936. And I think the Cinderella movie came out in 1960s sometime. So